This is a special presentation from WZMQ 19 News. The dream lives on.
Good evening and welcome to MLK, The Dream Lives On. I'm Sarah Blakely. For the next 30 minutes, we honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You'll see Dr. King's awe-inspiring I Have a Dream speech, and we'll examine from the local perspective Dr. King's legacy and mark the progress made in the area of equal rights and social justice. We begin with the local perspective on this Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Our Scott Minshaw gives us a look at the civil rights movement's impact on Northern Michigan University.
Northern Michigan University, like most of the Upper Peninsula, has a long and not always pretty past regarding the civil rights movement. In the late 1960s into the early 70s, multiple protests and even small-scale riots on Northern's campus were brought on by injustices not only here in Marquette, but also seen around the country. According to the university archives, protests and activism on campus led to improvements on campus. Student leaders right here at Northern went as far to testify in Lansing and strive for improvements. The unrest in the community led to things like the Community University Council, which allowed community members and students to discuss the issues the university was facing related to civil rights. In the 50 years since the protests that took place on Northern's campus, improvements and strides have been made, but students are still fighting for some of the same causes. Groups on campus like Social Justice for Us hold activism events regularly here in Marquette, marching in support of things like the Black Lives Matter movement and for women's rights. Northern has come a long way since the protests in the 1960s, but students continue to seek improvements just as those before them. Scott Minshaw, WZMQ 19 News, Marquette.
Dr. King's legacy continues to inspire those living in and around the UP. In Michigan, leaders continue to break boundaries and maintain the ideas MLK held. Our Sophia Murphy went to Lansing to speak with a newly appointed Supreme Court justice inspired by the MLK legacy.
Dr. King fought for justice and equality for Black people in the U.S. Who better to continue that work than our Supreme Court justices? Justice Kyra Harris Bolden is the first Black woman to sit on the Michigan Supreme Court. Before being appointed by Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Justice Bolden served as an attorney and represented what used to be Michigan's 35th District.
Yeah, the legacy of MLK means everything to me. I literally would not be in the position that I'm in without the work that he did, the other people that surrounded him and worked tirelessly.
Justice Bolden grew up in Southfield, Michigan, in the district she represented for 8 years. During her childhood in Southfield, Bolden remembers participating in the MLK Walk every year.
And my mom would put me in a little snowsuit because, it can get quite cold. And we would do that walk every year. It was so important for me to be involved in a celebration of the life of MLK and everything that he's done.
In her time working in the government, Justice Bolden has been open about her family history. Her great-grandfather, Jesse Lee Bond, was lynched in Tennessee in 1939.
And he was beaten and castrated and thrown into the local river. Thereafter, the coroner deemed it an accidental drowning, and his murderers walked free as a result. I knew I needed to be involved in the justice system to improve it in some way, shape, or form.
Now, Justice Bolden works to carry on the story of her family and the vision MLK had for the future of our country.
Everywhere, and particularly positions of power, deserve a diversity of backgrounds, experiences, perspectives. That's what makes our country great, is that we can all have a dream, as MLK did, and aspire to that.
Sophia Murphy, WZMQ 19 News.
Justice Bolden says she's excited to be the example for younger generations so students can see that they're capable of anything. Kenneth B. Morris is a direct descendant of both Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, prominent figures in African American history. This week, we interviewed Mr. Morris for our program.
We need to know where we've come from in order to know where we're headed. And history is not just about the past. History is about the present, and it's also about the future. And I think for young people, and at my organization, Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, we spend a lot of time in K through 12 schools, and we spend a lot of time talking about history and talking about the importance of my ancestors, talking about education. and just really giving them this idea that we need to know where we come from in order to know where we're headed.
Morris says his family legacy resulted in a calling for him to leverage history to help change the future and bring attention to the continued fight against all types of slavery in the modern world. Coming up next, meet a man living in the UP with remarkable experiences involving Reverend Jesse Jackson and the late Representative John Lewis. MLK, The Dream Lives On, continues in just a moment.
Welcome back to The Dream Lives On.
Welcome back to our special tribute to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Christopher Kays lives right here in the UP. His background includes working with Reverend Jesse Jackson and civil rights leader John Lewis. He also attended the funeral of Dr. King's wife, Coretta Scott King. Here is his story in his own words as told by our Mitchell Rife.
Yeah, so it started in Milwaukee when I was 8 years old in 1988 when Jesse Jackson was running for president. And after the speech, he leaned down and kind of asked for me to be tossed up from the crowd to up on stage, and he picked me up and a little girl and told us to wave at the crowd. And at the time, he was actually, he had more death threats than anybody else in U.S. history, so I guess it was a little risky, but I thought it was great and got to wave at the first crowd of people. Kind of stayed in touch with it after that and ended up going down to Morehouse in Atlanta where Martin Luther King went to school and graduated there in 2005. And while I was there, I started interning for Reverend Jesse Jackson, working on their Operation Breadbasket is what Martin Luther King called it, but it's the next stage of the civil rights movement was more economic emancipation and leveling the playing ground when it comes to capital and business. Yeah, Coretta Scott King passed away also when I was just finishing at Morehouse. I was actually working for Kwanzaa Hall, who was from Martin Luther King's old ward in Atlanta. So he was running for city council at the time. And yeah, it was obviously she was kind of the legacy. She, did a lot after he passed away to kind of keep his, just the whole story alive, and to be able to go to there and just see the respect that was given to her from across the political aisle. I mean, you had 4 presidents there, I believe. Both the Bushes, you had Clinton, and Carter were all there. So it was nice to be able to be part of that. And yeah, it was during a bit of a controversial time. Bush was president at the time. You had a lot going on with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan at the time. But
the full interview with Chris Kays is available right now at our website, WZMQ19.com. Honoring the African American story is essential for our growth and understanding. That's the goal for the National Museum of African American History and Culture in our nation's capital. WZMQ's Rachel Knapp reports.
Just steps away from the Washington Monument and along the National Mall is the National Museum of African American History and Culture. From the outside, it stands out for its unique design.
Reminiscent of a crown, and also featuring the ironwork traditions of people in the Deep South.
And on the inside,
there's a lot to see.
The associate director of the museum says the museum is steeped in the American experience through an African American lens.
And what you get is really a chronological history of the African American presence in the Americas, the arrival of the first enslaved people to these shores, and looking at that journey over time up until this point. We get to President Obama's inauguration in 2008.
With the use of about 40,000 artifacts, visual pieces, storytelling, and more, the museum says all exhibitions are formed by another exhibition that helps share the African American story, including aspects like professions, the role of the church, sports. The museum also highlights the civil rights movement.
The era of segregation really gives you the backstory of what has happened, how people came together, fighting against lynching, promoting your own newspapers, building entrepreneurial societies, businesses, and the like, that kind of traces that lineage to the modern civil rights movement that we know when MLK and other people galvanized and created this critical moment in history.
What they want visitors to take away from their experience is to understand that history is made and created by all people.
Storytelling is key. It's key to remembering who we are, and it's key to shaping who we are going to be in the future. And that this museum will always be a place for reflection.
Still ahead, Dr. King's famous I Have a Dream speech.